Phillips. I've come to talk to you about ideas to options, fairly broad-ranging subject. It's quite intimidating reading the guest list and seeing that you are all from some fairly august organisations, and many of you have already done projects. So if I'm teaching you to suck eggs, you'll have to put up with me in the hope that there's a few people who've never been through this process before and that it might be of value to them. And I hope if there's anything that you find particularly interesting or to challenge me on as I speak, please butt in. I'm quite happy to have comments. I'm going to talk for a little bit first just about the structure of how you look at options and the relationship between what you're doing, your organisation, and how you develop the options. It's a bit boring because it's slides of words. I'll speak to them. Then I'm going to talk to you about some of the projects that we've been involved in and some case studies. All of these projects I'm going to show you started with options appraisals. Some of them started with things called conservation management plans, but which turned into options appraisals. So they'll give you a good idea of the complexity and substance of projects that you can take on if you start on a good foundation, a good options appraisal. But then you're going to do some work. On all of your tables there's a pack of sheets for some projects that we're involved in. And we're going to ask you to, in about 15-20 minutes, come up with a quick options appraisal for that building. And your interlocutor on your group will then come up at the end and give us 1 minute's view as to what might happen to that building that you've got in focus. And I'll give you some prompts for how you might do it on the screen. And then at the very end, I'm going to tell you actually what's happening to those buildings. And the prize for the group that gets closest to what's actually happening will be a free day of my time at our cost, wherever you want. So hopefully it's a really good prize and you'll get very excited about it. I only just caught the plane, I have to say, so there is a risk with this free prize. I might not get here till late. Anyway, and then at the end, obviously, any questions, and I'll be happy to help you. Firstly, the issue is ideas to options. You have to ask yourself, well, what comes first? As a building preservation trust, you probably aren't sitting there with an idea that you then go out and look for a building. You're probably got a building or a building problem, and the actual issue is, what ideas can you develop relative to that building to find a solution? If the idea does come first, then of course the building solution doesn't necessarily need to involve an existing building. It could be a new building, it could be something you build yourself. So the first process there is to actually do a feasibility study. I regard a feasibility study as something where the idea comes first and the building second. If, however, the building is first, and you have to find the ideas and see if the ideas and the uses fit the building, then that's when you need an options appraisal, and that's the sort of substance of what I'm going to talk about today. There's also quite another important issue. Are you just going to develop this building that you've got that's a problem, develop it and sell it, revolve the money and move on to the next project? Or are you actually going to stay in there for the long term, in which case you have to find a different mix of uses and revenue becomes more important than the immediate financial return? Now those are quite an important set of differences. If you go for the develop and sell, there are some issues. You don't get necessarily the same sort of long-term involvement and commitment from the local community in your project. If you develop a building as residential use and you just sell it, actually you might be missing out something. I think a very important thing is that you don't get any increase in the asset value over time. If you think about it, many of the buildings you'll be doing with are buildings in an area itself which may need regeneration. There's a process going to go on there. If you do your project first and sell it quickly, your project has a big impact on that area and how it develops. If you don't stay in there for the long term, you lose the incremental growth that your success will deliver to that community. So hanging on in there might mean your building might just about break even if you sell it, but if you hang on in there in 10 years' time, you might be sitting on a very substantial asset that then gives your organisation a robustness to take on other projects. Often if you're revolving them, you get less access to grant aid. The HLF, for example, will only fund the conservation deficit, not the whole project. You get no retained value in the future. You lose the potential that building can have to deliver you income. That income is really important because it's not just about paying the bills for the building, but many of you as organisations will be stretched in terms of your human resources. If you can generate income, you might be able to pay a part-time director, somebody whose expertise you can retain within the organisation, and you can keep that learning about the process of developing the building. So, and for these sorts of projects, at the bottom is a very easy equation, which I think is quite important, and one you all should bear in mind, which is that the value, what you sell the building for, you give away for, is equal to the costs less the grants. And you can mutate that equation, but what it says is that for most of the projects you're going to be dealing with, there's a deficit, a conservation deficit. In other words, the value is less than the cost of it for you to do. And so working out that equation, the components, is one of the key things that you have to do in terms of developing options. If you want to take a longer term stakeholding, which is something I feel personally quite strongly about third sector organisations doing, you have some other issues. I mean, the first one is that it's going to be harder. There's more organisational commitment. Rather than just acquiring a building, doing it up, selling it, end of story, you've got to be thinking all the way through, well, what am I going to do with it afterwards? How am I going to make money? How's it going to pay for its maintenance? All those sorts of things. If you do keep it, then you will be able to retain the skills and experience, and you get that enhanced value over the time. You know, you contribute to the regeneration of the area, so you benefit from that. Projects like this, very often, in capital terms, can get 100% funding. If you're keeping the building, you're putting it to productive uses. Now, don't get put off by the fact that some of the uses that you may be looking at options are commercial uses. Because the HLF and funders are quite happy with commercial uses if those uses are contributing to the long-term sustainability of the project. So mixing publicly accessible, interesting uses with uses that support them financially in revenue terms is actually a good mix and something that funders are really interested in. The most important thing is the bottom, that you know, when you hang on to it, you're making a real commitment to your community. Community buy-in is a really important thing in these projects, and I'll come on to that a little bit later. So, you've got your building, you're not quite sure what to do with it, you've got lots of ideas flying around. How do you actually go through a process where you bring those initial components, the building and the ideas, to something that's actually ready to go and deliver as a project? I think it's a fairly straightforward process, but it is important that one does it in a logical and sequential manner. Too many people say, building, idea, yes, that's what we'll do, without actually looking at the consequences you go through. So it's a three-stage process. The first one is, you know, getting the facts, understanding the building, understanding the issues that you're trying to solve. The second one is about exploring how the ideas and the building fit together. What are your options to do that? And then at the end of that stage, making a decision. Okay, all of these options, which one are we going to pick? Then lastly, when you've got your preferred choice, you develop that out to give you the basic information, which then gives you the platform to make your Heritage Lottery Fund bids, to finalise the deal with the person who's selling you the building or giving it to you, preferably, and actually getting to the point where you can deliver the scheme. I shouldn't say never buy a building. You don't need to buy these buildings. If they've got a conservation deficit, they should be free to you. In fact, they should be better than free to you. If it's owned by a local authority, it should give you a contribution towards a conservation deficit, as well as never assume that you need to pay for these buildings. Some of them are massive. Okay, so building that understanding. There's the obvious things. How big's the building? What size is it? Size is a very interesting thing because size also means money. Some of the projects on your tables are huge buildings. The solution to the problem in terms of use is easy. The issue is it's big, so it's lots of money. But other things like built form. I mean, one of the things I'm going to ask you to look at on your activity later is these buildings have particular plans, particular shapes. Does that impact on the uses you can put them to, and how does it impact on them? The second is about, is this building important? Obviously, the more important the building, the easier it is to get cash for, but perhaps the more constrained the uses and the ideas that you can push it towards. So things like its heritage asset value, its historic importance, its sensitivity to change, and its statutory designation. Where is your building? What are its settings, surroundings? How do those impact on the development that you're going to do? Can you get there by foot, by car, by bus, by transport? Have you got problems with party walls and adjacent owners and the abattoir and the steelworks next door? All the sort of things that actually have a big impact on value. Ownership. Right, this goes back to never pay for a building. Building owners always think their buildings are worth something. They never really take on board actually that they're not worth very much, in fact negative. There are some owners who, after a while, will come to the understanding of that. And if you can butter their bread a little bit and ease them through, perhaps with a share in the development profit at the end of the day, where they share risk, there are ways of doing it. But essentially, the aspiration and attitude of the owner is going to be a key to your ability to acquire it. Local authorities generally are quite sensible. They know if they've got a problem building, it's costing them a lot of money. Well, actually, they don't know necessarily that it's costing them a lot of money each year, but they know it's an issue. On that point, I should have said this, I think local authorities are really interesting. We're working on a fantastic Grade 1 listed mansion in Somerset, just south of Bristol. High value properties, £2 million houses all around. This place has a conservation deficit of about £8 million. It needs 20 or 30 million pounds spent on it, and its value at the end of the day is only 12, 13 million. So that local authority is sitting on a big negative asset. The local authority told us when we started, well, we're not really fussed about the decision. We'll wait. It's not costing us anything. Oh yes, I said. So the first thing we did when we were commissioned was to task them to actually pull out from their accounting records all the costs related to this building. They couldn't do it. Bits were run by parks, bits were run by buildings, bits were run by... So they didn't have a holistic view. It took us over 12 months to get figures. The figure that we eventually got to, believe it or not, for this building was 750,000, was what it was costing the local authority every year, and the building wasn't even open to the public. That caused quite a sensation when we gave the figures to them, and the local authority had to step back and realise that actually we'd given them their own figures back, and that was their cost. We had a political directive to put a red line through that and reduce it to 250,000 a year. So the costs of looking after a building that local authorities think nothing is a big component in getting them to give it to you for nothing, and also perhaps giving some cash to go with the project. So I've dwelt a bit on that. The planning and statutory context, you know, are you in a green belt? Is it listed? What are the planning policies are there? What are the planning preferences? Not usually an issue with historic buildings, except when you're looking at enabling development, which I'll come to. What's your local economy in your region? Like the context, the values of properties. This is quite important because if you're in certain parts of the country, the economy will be such that you get ERDF, European money, and other sources of funds to look at. Very important one, the community objectives. What do the people who live around this building, who use it quite possibly, think about it? It's quite interesting how many communities consider buildings as theirs. They're not actually theirs, but they might have walked through the park for the last 10 years with their dog. So it's our building, and we don't anything to it. That's a really important resource for you to harness in taking options forward. So getting in touch with the community and understanding how they can make a play with you is a really important aspect. There's other issues, like extraordinary issues. Does it flood? You know, Rosie, because we know what it does. Contamination, restrictive covenants, all those sorts of things are very important. And then last thing, at the end of that first stage, is there anything you need to do really quickly? Get organised. Is your roof about to collapse? So when you've done that and you've reviewed it, effectively what you've defined is the constraints within which your ideas have got to deliver a solution. And those constraints are very important to understand, important to have a clear picture of. So then we move on. Right, the first thing is, okay, what user options are there? And are any of those potential partners? Delivering projects with partners is always a really good idea because it spreads risks, it increases your resources, increases your capacity, your experience, and people like the funders love partnerships because it's a sign of people working together. So whatever ideas you have, you need that buy-in. Use and user options can sometimes be quite difficult to find. If a building's been left there for years and years and years, people may not actually have any ideas of what to do with it, and you'll often see that, you know, it's an old ruin, pull it down, because people don't have the vision to do it. It's quite often the case that actually you don't find any obvious users or partners, and you therefore have to think about what uses could we put this building to yourself, and then test it, as I said, against the market. You know, are there people interested in using it? Would people be interested in buying it, renting it, tenanting it, and how does that achieve the value? When you've got a picture of those uses, you look at them collectively, and there's sometimes the combination of uses that you could put in a building add up to a vision, the big idea. Sometimes it's quite difficult to construct that big idea. And I'm actually usually quite suspicious of big ideas, because big ideas usually mean lots of money has to be found for them. You know, the Centre for Historic Building Research in Edinburgh, for example, rings to me, say, right, who's going to fund it? Who's going to pay the bills for the staff? And all those sorts of things. The next stage is to, with your collection of uses, to then actually do a quick imprint of those uses on the building. Do they fit? You know, can you put a tennis court in a building that's got a bigger space and no bigger than the size of this room? Those sorts of quite simple issues. Identifying if the uses do fit, what the level of change is going to be. Are those changes acceptable to what you, to your local authority, to English heritage? And they actually can be quite important. One of the projects you're going to look at on your sheets, we had a solution that involved one staircase. English heritage didn't like one staircase, they wanted 2 staircases. And we had a real battle with them. We had to take it to the point where they were going to refer us to the Secretary of State and get an inquiry. Fortunately, they pulled out last minute. But the issue was, by putting 2 staircases in, they lost 19% of the lettable floor area and 17% of the potential income. In other words, how you fit the building with the uses into the building and everything you need to find out uses can have a big impact on your income and your costs. Yeah, the other thing was it cost an extra $125,000 with the extra staircase. In many cases where those uses don't fit, you have to consider, well, do we need to extend this building to actually get this use in and to provide what they need? Do we need to extend it? One of the sheets on your tables is actually already a very big building, but we're building an almost equally big extension because there's one particular object that won't go in the building that we have to house. More on that later. A thorough understanding of the options for all the car parking, access, how to get there, the scope of the works, and then at this second stage, a very important step, getting some comparative costs between all the options. Which one's cheapest? Which one's most expensive? In parallel, looking at the funding options. Which of these uses are we more likely to get grants for? You know, if you've got a residential development, you're going to get a lower grant from the HLF than if you've got a top-class museum or a public learning facility. So they're quite important. And then not just the build costs, but also the development costs. On most of the projects that I'm involved in, where there's a building cost and lots of other activities funded by people like the HLF, the actual construction cost is often only about half of the overall development cost and project cost. So it's quite significant to understand what those other development costs are. Lastly, or not lastly, but if you've been through the process of working out the costs, looking at the funding options, and there's a gap, in other words, if that equation I gave you at the beginning, values cost less grants, if that doesn't work, you may have to look for other sources of revenue and funding. Now, people talk about that later on today, but enabling development in the context of historic buildings can be a very important thing to unlock the financial situation. There is a legal and planning structure for enabling development, but don't forget that enabling development can enable in terms of capital money. In other words, it can give you some grant help towards the building cost. But enabling development can also help in revenue terms, in that it helps you actually make the project sustainable as you go on. Then lastly, and I advocate this, although many people don't do it in options appraisals, I think it's really important to do yourself a quick spreadsheet of the financial model. How much is it going to cost to run? How much might you get in income? There's lots of red lines at the bottom. Then you've got to look at how you rebalance that. You can do it on a single page spreadsheet. It's really quick. It's not a full business plan, but it just gives you an inkling. It just gives you a lead in to whether this project's going to be viable and your great idea is going to end up as dust when it fails to cover its costs. Then lastly, consultations and stakeholders. Share your conclusions with all the people who might help and support your project and get them on board. And that ranges from the very top, your local politicos, your MEPs, all the rest of it, to the little kids down the street who play in the park and play football. They can play a surprisingly big role. So at the end of stage 2, it's decision time. Of all those options, you have to take a balanced view as to what you're going to do, how you're going to go forward, and make a decision and move on. Stage 3, I think, is fairly obvious because it's about actually developing that information on the preferred option that you have. And in doing that, also expressing it as a vision and as a collection of ideas that is going to excite people. That won't just be about the physical conversion of the building, but it will be about all the other things it delivers. What community benefits, what economic regeneration benefits, what training opportunities, what opportunities for people who are socially, ethnically disadvantaged. So it's a big picture. Some fairly obvious things. You do the drawings and the specifications to a stage that you're comfortable with gives you a reasonably accurate answer. You look in detail at the conservation issues and you develop a conservation strategy and understand the impact of changes. These days, sustainability is a really important issue. Have you done everything that you can within reason to make your building energy efficient? Are you able to use local contractors, or have you specified something that comes from Germany? Those sorts of issues. You work up the cost plan in more detail. You do a long-term maintenance plan. I don't know many of you have done long-term maintenance plan. If you go to the HLF, you have to do one. The long-term maintenance plan is really critical because it tells you what that building is going to cost year on year on year on year. People always underestimate. Whenever I do one, the first figure on that bottom line, people are very shocked at. But essentially, if you're going to the funders, they're going to say, okay, I'm giving you £2 million. In 10 years' time, is it going to be falling down again? So you have to have that answer, and you have to build into your plans, whatever the bright idea, it's got to actually be grounded in a real understanding of what your obligations are going to be in the future towards keeping that building in good repair. Every 15 years, you're going to have to replace the boiler and the lift. Every 50 or 60 years, you're going to have to do major works to external joinery. Are you setting money aside in the sinking fund to do that? Or have you got one of your partners, perhaps the local authority, backing you up with the support to do that? I've talked about financial models. In stage 3, you're doing a bit more work. You have to look critically at your organisational structure. In this stage, you're now framing your project and how it's going to go forward. Have you got the skills, the bottle and the people inside your organisation to do it? And if not, how do you get them? If it's a complex structure, you've got 2 or 3 partners, often the case in some of these projects. Have you got the deals, the partnership agreements in place? Who's going to do what and who's going to commit what? Have you got the deal done with the owner? Are they prepared to give you a commitment that you can then encapsulate in your stage 3 conclusions and go forward to the funders? How long is it going to take you? What's the programme for implementation? It's always longer than you're going to think, but it's a good idea to have a clue. And as part of that programme, what are you going to need to do for the next steps? Define the things that you are going to have to do to get your HLF bid in, get your local authority on board in terms of putting in £1 million or whatever you're going to ask them for. And then lastly, the last set of consultations, going public with your ideas and how you're going to achieve them and getting the support built in. As I say, I can't overestimate. At that stage, you're what I say, ready to go. You're nearly there. Okay, I've been told off. So some really quick projects. 45-acre cemetery, 6th grade 2 star list of buildings, grade 1 landscape, over 500,000 burials, no land value, in Bristol called Arnesdale Cemetery. We put together a series of development options for each of the buildings. A family history centre, performance space in the chapel at the top, turned the gardens, the landscape into gardens. And we put together quite a substantial funding package, just over 10 million. A very, very big element of volunteer resource in that. What I find is interesting about this one is that the business plan only actually picked up half of the things that the buildings ended up being used for. And the biggest element of income is something that nobody dreamed about first off: weddings. Who would have thought people would want to get married in a cemetery? But think about it. Lovely buildings, lovely gardens, places to park, Grandad kipping under a stone slab up the road. And you suddenly think, well, why didn't we think of that? It's a great idea. Many of these projects are quite modest. This is Kenaway House in Sidmouth. The importance of these buildings in small communities is what they can give to the community. This is a building that's now in full use. It has all sorts of music, gallery, events, a little cafe, and it builds its income, its sustainability from those things. It doesn't give anything away. Everything it does is charged for to make sure its income matches its costs. As part of that programme, these were some of the community activities that we did. Run proper community programmes when you're developing your scheme to see what's out there in terms of activities. Some projects are really substantial. This is one actually that the Regeneration Trust made many of the initial steps with. It's Cardigan Castle. It's just finishing at the moment, so I don't have any projects. But you can see the range of buildings, the range of different uses. Each of those different uses had to be planned, modelled, figured out together in a collective way as to how they work, and a scheme put together. The combinations of funding, the percentages of funding that each organisation would give to different bits, believe me, it required a computer the size of HAL in 2001. Sometimes the options appraisal is really simple, because what do you use a pier for? Walk out. It doesn't reduce the fact that it's a wonderful structure that, in this case, it was in pretty terminal condition. It collapsed after load testing. And it was funny that a local group of people, which I was one when I was wearing short trousers, fought a public inquiry when the local authority tried to demolish it, and we won, thinking, good, now the local authority will do it. And instead they turned around and said, okay, you clever buggers, it's yours, you did it. So we gave them a quid, and 20 years later, we had it finished, and it's a great thing. The point being here is that this is really, don't be put off by projects, 45-acre cemetery at 10 million quid. It's doable, honestly. This one has had an incredible impact on its community. I wish I'd stood at the end of the pier with one of those time-lapse cameras the year after it's opened, because all of a sudden, after 15 years being closed, 120,000 people a year have come to this pier. And within 12 months, every single commercial building on the seafront had been repainted. There's another one, Penarth Pier. I'm not going to dwell on these because I'm running out of time. Quite ambitious, this is quite an interesting one, and again it's about the scale of the project. This is a grade 2 star listed mansion with lots of different outbuildings. The point about this is that the overall development bill is about 15 million. Clearly we're not going to get funding package together, that's how we felt. So the project was divided up into digestible chunks, and it's being done on a phased basis, and with the key parts that deliver income coming first so it becomes sustainable, and the bits that don't deliver income being done as we can raise the grants as we go on. Some lovely outbuildings, and that's underway on site. This is one, just to tell you that Prince's Regeneration does do real projects. This is one they've done in Cornwall, which is a really interesting project. It's so called in Cardiff. And then the last one I'll show you is this, about enabling. This is a big complex of grade 2 listed buildings built in the 50s, very interesting early structures. There's a bunch of artists. Artists mostly on the dole, don't have a lot of cash. 120 of them wanted to take on this building. It's 180,000 square feet, right? Big. Brook Bond owned it, wanted 1.4 million for it. Where are the artists going to get that? What everyone didn't know is Brook Bond's lease had a restricted user clause in it from the city, so Brook Bond couldn't sell it for 1.4 million because they would have to get a planning application for residential use to get that value. So the deal was, the city gave planning application on that part of the site for residential development. That delivered Brook Bond some money. So Brook Bond gave the lease back to the city, keeping that part. The city allowed them to sell it, and then passed the blue bit on to the artist for nothing on a lease. And it was actually a bit better than that, because when Brook Bond sold it, they got 400,000 more than they said they were going to get. They thought they were going to get, so the city had that and gave it to the artists as well. So the process, and this is an important thing in your options process, how you get those legal transactions in place. I won't go through this, but I'll give you copies of it if you want. The process of getting those things in place can be quite complex and can often mask the ideas. I mean, it's a great project. It's now the richest arts organisation in the southwest, packed with people. The artists get their studios effectively free because the commercial space they left, of the bit they left, which is 120,000 square feet, they let 40. So they get 200,000 a year income. Great if you're penniless artists. I'm a great believer in Preston. You know, none of these schemes are original. There's always somebody who's done it before you. And our Cromford project, we all took a client visit to Lanark, to New Lanark, and we learnt a huge amount from what they've done there. And our client came away absolutely full of ideas and a real understanding of the strategy, how you develop that. So, you know, if I could say anything that you should do after today is talk to other people, go and see other people's projects, find out the good things about them and also the things that went wrong, so that when you're doing your projects, you're well armed. So, I think we've run out of question time, haven't we? Yeah?
I think so, unfortunately, but thank you so much.
Okay, well I hope you got something out of it. Thank you very much.